Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to be a continuation of a previous lesson from the 14th chapter in the book of Matthew. The range we most recently covered was verses 13 through 21. We're going to take this from 22 all the way to 36, but because of the brevity of this lesson's predecessor, we're going to begin our review in this lesson's predecessor's predecessor. The 14th chapter opens, Yahshua's ministerial activity is sufficient enough to generate the attention of the tetrarch Herod Antipas, and he's convinced that John the Baptist has been risen from the dead, and he had recently arrested him and imprisoned him on account of his fearless denunciation of his sin, which was a violation of Leviticus 18:4. Herod Antipas had married his half-brother Herod Philip's wife, Herodias, who was a granddaughter of Herod the Great, and he said it was not right for you to have her. And wanting to kill him, he feared the crowd because they held him as a prophet. Verse 5. So he has a conflict within him. He sees this man, the threat that he poses. He's undermining him. There was no such thing as criticizing autocrats. This is a democratic right that we often take for granted. But he knows that the crowd is in his corner. They regard him as a prophet, and he doesn't want to mess. He fears the retaliation of the masses, as many rulers should. But it's on his birthday when his wife's daughter, through her former liaison, her marriage to Herod Philip, this woman's is not named, but she's known as Salome from the writings of Josephus, and there's plenty of famous paintings of Salome. And what she does is she dances seductively to his satisfaction, so much so that he impulsively exclaims that he will give anything to her, up to half the kingdom in Mark's version. But he makes it an oath, and it's in public, so everyone who's anybody in his region, Galilee, is there. And and the sovereign was sad, but because of the oaths and the guest, he commanded it to be given. Her request was to execute John the Baptist. It was at her mother's behest that she made her request to behead John the Baptist and bring his head on a dish. This was not an uncommon practice in the ancient world for conquering kings to display their vanquished foes on heads. But he immediately regrets it. But he knows that he had made his oath, which was binding in public, and then it's done as requested. And then verse 12, and his disciples came and took away the body and buried it, and went and reported to Yahshua. The disciples were the disciples of John the Baptist. He had disciples. The Pharisees had disciples. A disciple just means a learner or a student or a servant. That is the nature of the master-disciple relationship. But these disciples of John the Baptist tell the news to Yahshua, who immediately retreats, but he can't get away for long or very far, because the crowd is going to follow him no matter where they go. They empty out the cities. Verse 14, and when Yahshua came, he saw a large crowd and was moved with compassion for them and healed their sick. Compassion is the motivating incentive for many of the miracles throughout the Gospels of the Messiah. He was a compassionate man, and he could not behold anyone who was sick, lame, blind, or anything else and not extend his healing hand when there was a suffering sick person in his midst. That's just inconsistent with his nature. But then we get to the true event of this section. This is the feeding of the 5,000, verse 15, which is a miracle because they did not have the amount of food to feed anywhere close to that number. Verse 15, and when evening came, his disciples came to him, saying, this is a deserted place, and the hour is already late. Dismiss the crowd so that they might go into the village and buy food for themselves. Now, can a man who is so moved by compassion that he cannot let a blind person continue to be blind when it's in his power to restore the sight? And no more than he could do that could he send this crowd that had gathered around him away on an empty stomach. It was nighttime, and the hour is late, and there's no food to feed this substantial crowd. So the disciples offer the counsel to send them away, dismiss them, and they'll go. But he intervenes, and he tells them that they're staying right here. And he requests, but then they say to him, we have here only 5 loaves and 2 fishes. And he says, give them to me. I'll feed feed the 5,000 with this measly, minuscule amount, and he proceeds to do that. Verse 19, and commanding the crowds to sit down on the grass, and taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to the heavens, he blessed and broke, and gave to the loaves to the disciples, and the disciples gave to the crowds. This event is common to all 4 Gospels, and every single one of them have him precede the opening of the food, the giving of the food with thanksgiving. So he acknowledged the miracle to the Father, and he proceeds to distribute a sufficient amount from this measly, minuscule amount, sufficient enough to feed 5,000, so much so that they actually end up with more behind than they had to begin with. 12 baskets, they filled them, and this is a lesson in resourcefulness. We mustn't waste anything that he provides. In the number, it was actually more than 5,000 people. It's 5,000 men plus women and children in the 21st verse, and this takes us to the 22nd verse, which marks the lesson itself. And immediately Yahshua made his disciples enter into the boat and go before to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds. What's not exactly clear in Matthew's account is the immediacy and the urgency for him to escape, but that is revealed in John 6 chapter, the 15th verse. They wanted to make him king prematurely. They had the wrong motivations. First off, they weren't there to be spiritually fed. They were carnal creatures, most of them, to be fed by their bellies, and that's why they came to him, but he needs to get away from it all once again. He retreats in solitude to pray, much as he did. He got away once he heard the news, but the people from the cities emptied out and followed him, whereas we read earlier before. But he dismissed the crowds. He had fed them, and he tells his disciples to enter into a boat. They would have been at the Sea of Galilee. The Sea of Galilee, by its physical, geographical situation, is prone to violent storms. Whirlwinds come and go because of the way that it is situated. It's about 600 feet of mountains around it, and this exacerbates the winds, and that's what they are precisely up there while he is praying in solitude. And having dismissed the crowds, he went up to the mountain by himself to pray, and when evening has come, he was alone there. So solitude is essential. Now, Christianity is a communal religion, but it also does involve and demand solitude and silence. If the Son of Man was reliant on his alone time with the Father, how much more are we? So we have to make a practice of retreating from the world, surrounding ourselves with the silence so that we can concentrate and pray alone and commune and talk to our Heavenly Father, and he in fact does talk to us back. The problem is most people aren't aware of it. They think of prayer as a one-ended conversation, but he does speak to me, and I'm not the only one when I pray and when others pray. But by the evening, he was alone there, so this is a different day because the evening in verse 15 was the day of the 5,000. So this is he's up there all day, and his disciples are in the boat in the Sea of Galilee. But the boat was now in the middle of the sea, agitated by the waves, for the wind was against it. Wind was a common delay, or maybe not common, but when it came, it was certainly severe because of the geographical, physical situation, its proximity to the Mediterranean Sea and the hills which surrounded it. In some way, I can't quite explain it, but it exacerbated the winds and made them more intense. So this is not a good place to be in the middle of the Sea of Galilee when there is a sandstorm against you. So part of fishing and navigating is to travel with the wind. So much before pre-steam engine ships, the wind sails, even in ocean navigating vessels, would have to cooperate with the wind. So if you're in an ancient boat, a fishing boat, and the winds are against you, your situation is going to be more precarious than it would otherwise be. And when the disciple... And in the 4th watch of the night, Yahshua went to them, walking on the sea. The 4th watch of the night would have occurred between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. Remember the time frame, it is evening, he is still there, but it's 3 in the morning. The 4th watch, now this is a Roman measurement time. Their 4th watch occurred between 3 in the morning and 6 a.m., and the Jews had 3 watches, but Matthew's operating on Roman time. But just to know what the fourth watch means, this is early in the morning. They're in the middle of the sea, and it is dark outside, and their ship is at the mercy of the elements. And they see, and suddenly the one whose mastery over the elements is going to be demonstrated is walking on the water. This is a defiance of the laws of physics. If any of us, try to duplicate this miracle, we would sink right in. But because he is master of the elements, they're in his command, they're in his control. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, "It is a phantom," and from fear they cried. So they don't know what they're seeing. They intuitively imagine that it is a ghost. Perhaps the surrounding intensity of the sea exacerbated their fear, so they have a naturally fearful reaction to someone walking on the water. They had just seen him multiply loaves of bread, 5 loaves and 2 fishes to feed 5,000. And they could not fathom, because they hadn't seen anything like it yet. But anyone who is able to do that is pretty much able to do anything with the laws of physics. So it was not a ghost. It was Yahshua in the flesh walking on water, but they are fearful because they do not know who it is. But immediately Yahshua spoke to them, saying, "Take courage, it is I, do not be afraid." Fear not is a frequent message throughout the scriptures. Now, fear and faith cannot coexist simultaneously in the same vessel. One cancels out the other no more than any one man cannot serve 2 masters. Can fear and faith simultaneously reside in the same vessel at the same time and in equal proportion? If you are faithful, you will not be fearful. If you are fearful, you will not be faithful. So he's assuring them, don't fear, take courage. In fact, it's me, it is I. They can recognize the voice. The sheep do respond to the shepherd's voice. And don't be afraid. There's really no reason to be fearful, because I am here. These elements in my wind, and if I can walk on water, so too can you. And this is eventually what Simon Peter does, fleetingly, as we witness. And Peter answered him and said, "Master, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." So Peter is usually the spokesman of the 12. He is impulsive and compulsive, but to his credit, he is courageous but careless. So he still harbors this doubts and suspicions that this might be a phantom, this might be a ghost. He does not recognize the master's appearance, and the voice is a little hazy. So he needs the reassurance, he needs a command to come to him on the water, that he can do what he is doing, because through him I can do all things through Messiah who strengthens me. Philippians 4:19 or 4:13, I forget which one. But in any case, Peter's request is accommodated. Verse 29, and he said, "Come." And when Peter had come down out of the boat, he walked on the water to go to Yahshua. John 14:12 says, "Even greater things than I have performed, you will perform through the power of the Spirit." In that, so anything he can do, we can do, and it's really a matter of faith. He says that if we say uproot a mountain or anything else, then if we have sufficient faith, then it can happen. Of course, that miracle is not necessary, and miracles are either necessary or they are just satanic. That is the motivation of the miracle. But because he is able to walk on water, he is able to enable the disciple in physical proximity, Peter, the spokesman, the lead, the chief disciple, his most loyal lieutenant, who had a lot of faults and defects. The Gospels does not conceal the warts and all, and nor the Bible itself, and that is the most compelling testimony of its truthfulness. History, as was written before the Hebrew people, any other ancient world, they were not in the practice of advertising their defects, but the Hebrew people record the sins of their leaders and their people to survive as warnings for the present audience. But when he saw the wind was strong, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, saying, "Master, save me." He was walking on water, and all it took was a sudden gust of wind, and because he became fearful, he began to sink. So he was able to walk on the water because he was faithful, but once the fear sets in, the faith is eliminated, and the laws of physics set back in. He's going to sink, and he's going to cry out for deliverance to save, because he cannot save himself. He's in the middle of the lake. You cannot swim there. At best, he can find his way back to the boat, but with the intensity and the gravity and the sheer volume of the storm, he is afraid, and understandably so. So it's easy to point the finger and say, but we would have done the same things. Peter is human, so too are we. And immediately Joshua stretched out his hand and took hold of him and said to him, O you of little faith, why did you doubt? So immediately, again, that word indicates the urgency of the situation. So Peter's sinking, and before he can sink and drown, that's when he steps into the rescue. He stretches out his hand, lifts him up, and tells him the same thing, "O you of little faith." He says much the same thing in the 6th chapter, his Sermon on the Mount, the section on living, 6:30, about living with kingdom priorities, and he chides the lack of faith of people who invest in worldly wealth and mammon and worry about what they wear, where they're going to eat, where they're going to live. So the same thing he says to the men of mammon is the same thing he says to Peter. Why did you doubt? And the reason he doubted is because he was walking by sight. He saw the wind, he could sense it physically, but he was not walking by faith, whereas formerly he was walking by faith. But once the opposition set in, or the source of the doubt kicked in, it overwhelmed him and he began to sink. So that's why he doubted, and that's also why he sank. He sank because he doubted, and he doubted because he sank because he doubted, shall we say. And when they came in the boat, the wind ceased. So as soon as he lifts them up and takes him to the boat, the wind stops, the storm calms. And other times he's asleep in the boat and he lays up his hand and says, "Peace, be still." And the wind calmed down, the lightning stopped flashing, and the disciples were even more afraid. They said, "What manner of man is this that even the winds obey him?" They had not yet come to the recognition that he was the King of Kings and the God of very gods. But they are sufficiently convinced. Their response indicates a confession of, this is a collective confession of the Son of Yahweh, whereas Peter makes that confession in the 16th chapter, but it's actually preempted. And those in the boat came up and bowed to him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of Yahweh." So they understood from this storm. Now in the earlier storm, this is in the 8th chapter of Matthew, I believe. So this takes forth. That's when they were not yet compelled to the conclusion that this man was divine. He was divine and he was a man, and he was the Son of Yahweh. So he was the Word incarnate, Word in the flesh, who came and pitched his tent among men. So they are exactly aware of who he is, and his command and control, and his calm, which calms the storm. He is calm in the midst of chaos. That indicates that his fearlessness at what stimulated a terrifying dread, a borderline deadly dread in them. His mastery over it just compelled them to the correct conclusion that he was, in fact, the Son of Yahweh. And having passed over, they came to the land of Gennesaret. This would have been a land around the Sea of Galilee. It may have been in Gentile territory, because remember, they're in the middle of the lake. The Sea of Galilee is the eastern extremity of the region of Galilee, so beyond the Sea of Galilee on the side they were in when they were crossing the lake, they may have been in Gentile territories. This term is also familiar it sounds suspiciously similar to the place of the demonic possessed man, although there's no consistent uniformity in the synoptics account as to the precise land, but it was in the same region, the man possessed by a legion of demons, which is also incidentally what happened after the episode I earlier described, when they had not yet come to they were said, "What manner of man is this?" They did not know that he was the Son of Yahweh, but they came to that conclusion by this point. So this is a milestone leap in their faith, the development of their faith. And when the men of that place recognized him, they sent out all that surrounding country and brought all to him who were sick. So we've seen this before in the 14th chapter. He's healing everybody in mass, everyone who's sick, everyone who's has an infirmity, his healing touch. So much where he goes, this is why the crowds follow him. The crowds, a lot of them didn't follow with the sincerest spiritual motives. A lot of them were there to be fed. A lot of them were wanted physical healing. But, some of them, he says that your faith has made you whole. So they were repentant. But here it doesn't describe any of the interactions, doesn't even say how many. All it says that all who were sick, so every single person in the region when this man came in, that was the time to, if you are paralyzed, to get yourself moving to him. Find someone who can pick you up and carry you and take him to him. And in one occasion in Mark's first chapter, the crowds are overwhelming the house that he is in, and the friends of this paralytic land him through the roof because they can't get in the door. And he was impressed by their faith and begged him to let only touch the tassel of his garment. And as many as touched it were completely healed. The touching of the garment is not completely or absolutely necessary, but it was necessary because their faith revolved around the idea that just by touching him, now he can heal from the distance, and this is what he says in reference to the Roman centurion who says, I am a man under command, I give orders, just say the word and my servant will be healed. He had more faith than them, but oftentimes we read that women touched his garment and they say your faith has made you whole. So it was just the action that they felt necessary to supplement their faith, and there's nothing wrong with it, and you can't argue with the results. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.